May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells ring across America. Confetti rains down on Times Square. Families embrace, knowing their sons will finally come home from the hell of European battlefields. But in a sparse military headquarters in war-torn Germany, General George S. Patton sits alone in the darkness, staring at a classified intelligence report that makes his blood run cold. The report contains names, American names, soldiers who should be processing through repatriation centers, who should be boarding ships bound for New York and Boston and San Francisco. Instead, these men have vanished behind what Winston Churchill will soon call the Iron Curtain, swallowed whole by America's supposed ally, the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, the man whose armies American taxpayers armed with billions in lend-lease equipment, whose soldiers fought alongside American forces to destroy Nazi Germany, has decided that thousands of liberated American POWs are now his prisoners, and when asked politely through diplomatic channels to return these men, Stalin has given an answer that will change the course of history yet. No. The war in Europe is over for everyone else, but for Patton, a new war, a secret war, a desperate war to save American soldiers from Soviet captivity is just beginning. Before we dive into this shocking true story that was classified for decades, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel uncovers the WWII stories they don't teach in schools. The classified operations and hidden truths that reveal what really happened behind the headlines. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Are you in the States? Europe? Somewhere else? Do you have a family member who served in World War II? Did they ever tell you stories that seemed too incredible to believe? Share them in the comments. Because today's story is exactly that kind of unbelievable truth. The situation Patton confronted in May 1945 was unprecedented in American military history. When Nazi Germany collapsed, when Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker ended the Third Reich, hundreds of thousands of prisoners from dozens of nations suddenly found themselves freed from German POW camps scattered across Europe. The logistics of sorting through this mass of humanity, identifying everyone, providing medical care, arranging transportation, home, were staggering. American, British, and Soviet forces had agreed in principle that prisoners would be repatriated according to nationality. British prisoners liberated by American forces would be transferred to British control. French prisoners would go to French authorities, and American prisoners, regardless of which Allied army freed them, would be returned to American custody for processing and transport home. It was simple, logical, and humanitarian. Except the Soviets had other ideas, as the Red Army swept across Eastern Europe in the war's final months, crushing German resistance with overwhelming force and staggering brutality. They overran dozens of POW camps. Conservative estimates suggest that Soviet forces liberated camps containing at least 25,000 American prisoners, possibly more. These Americans, airmen shot down over Eastern Europe, soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge and transported east, survivors of forced marches as the Germans retreated, waited for their deliverance, for American trucks to arrive and take them home. Those trucks never came. Instead, Soviet officers informed the bewildered Americans that they were being transported to collection points for eventual repatriation. The Americans, exhausted from months or years of captivity, malnourished and desperate to get home, had no choice but to comply. They were loaded into Soviet trucks and trains and moved eastward, not toward American lines but deeper into Soviet-controlled territory. Some ended up in former German POW camps that the Soviets had simply repurposed. replacing Nazi guards with Soviet ones. Others were dispersed to facilities in Poland, Czechoslovakia, even the Soviet Union itself. When American liaison officers attempted to locate these men, they were stonewalled. Soviet commanders claimed ignorance. Facilities that Americans knew contained American POWs were declared off-limits. Requests for access were denied or simply ignored. And when American officials went higher up the chain of command, when they brought the issue to Soviet military leadership and eventually to Stalin himself through diplomatic channels, they were told that all American prisoners had been repatriated. The men American intelligence knew were still in Soviet custody simply didn't exist, according to official Soviet statements. It was a lie so brazen, so easily disprovable, that American officials initially assumed it was a bureaucratic mistake, a communication breakdown in the chaos of the war's end. They were wrong. It was a deliberate policy, ordered from the very top of the Soviet government. Why would Stalin, whose nation had just fought alongside America to defeat Nazi Germany, suddenly kidnap thousands of American servicemen and refuse to return them? The answer lies in the twisted logic of Soviet paranoia and the emerging Cold War. During the war's final months, as Soviet armies advanced into German territory, they liberated not just American and British POWs but millions of Soviet citizens, Red Army soldiers who'd been captured by the Germans, civilians who'd been forced into slave labor, and people from Soviet territories that had been under German occupation. Stalin viewed all of these people with intense suspicion. In his totalitarian mindset, any Soviet citizen who'd been captured by the enemy was potentially contaminated by exposure to the West, possibly a traitor who'd collaborated with the Germans, certainly someone who needed to be filtered through NKVD interrogation before being allowed 2. Return to Soviet society. Many of these returned Soviet prisoners and civilians would end up in the Gulag system, the massive network of Soviet labor camps, where they'd be worked to death for the crime of having been captured. But Stalin faced a problem. Under agreements with the Western Allies, American and British prisoners were supposed to be immediately repatriated. However, in many of the camps that Soviet forces overran, German guards had deliberately mixed American and British prisoners with Soviet prisoners, sometimes in cynical attempts to use the Westerners as human shields, other times simply due to the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich. The Soviets wanted to retain all the Soviet prisoners for interrogation and filtering. But if American observers were present for repatriation, they'd witness the brutal treatment of returning Soviet citizens. They'd see Red Army soldiers who'd survived German captivity being arrested by their own country's security services. They'd see civilians being loaded onto trains, bound for Siberian labor camps. Stalin couldn't allow that. The solution, from the Soviet perspective, was simple: restrict American access, process the Soviet prisoners first and only, then gradually release Americans, if at all. But there was another, even darker dimension to Stalin's calculation. Thousands of the Soviet citizens the Red Army was liberating didn't want to return to the Soviet Union. They'd experienced just enough freedom, seen just enough of the outside world to know that Stalin's propaganda about the workers' paradise was a lie. Some had actively collaborated with the Germans, serving in auxiliary units or police formations. Others simply feared the gulag that they knew awaited anyone who'd been in German hands. These people tried to avoid Soviet repatriation, some attempting to blend in with displaced persons from other countries, others openly requesting asylum from American or British forces. The Western Allies faced an excruciating moral dilemma. Their agreement with Stalin obligated them to return Soviet citizens to Soviet control, even knowing many would be executed or sent to labor camps. In one of the most shameful episodes of the post-war period, American and British forces did exactly that, forcibly repatriating hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens who desperately didn't want to go back, sometimes at gunpoint. But Stalin worried that American forces might balk at this forced repatriation if they fully understood what awaited the returnees. By holding American POWs hostage, he created leverage. The implicit message was clear: you want your boys back? Then give me my people, no questions asked, and don't look too closely at what happens to them. General George S. Patton understood all of this with crystal clarity. As commander of the 3rd Army and one of America's most senior officers in Europe, he received intelligence reports about the missing POWs, about Soviet obstruction, about the emerging pattern of non-cooperation. Unlike some American and British officials who still hoped to maintain the wartime alliance into peacetime, who wanted to give Stalin the benefit of the doubt, Patton had no such illusions. He'd never trusted the Soviets. His anti-communist views were well known and had gotten him into trouble with the press and even with Supreme Commander Eisenhower. But on this issue, Patton's suspicions were proving devastatingly accurate. He knew that American soldiers were being held against their will behind Soviet lines. He knew that diplomatic channels were producing nothing but lies and delays. And he knew that if something wasn't done quickly, those men might disappear forever into the vast Soviet prison system, becoming ghosts, forgotten casualties of an alliance that had turned predatory the moment it was no longer needed. What Patton did next would be one of the most controversial decisions of his career, an operation so sensitive that it remained partially classified for decades. He decided that if the Soviets wouldn't return American prisoners through proper channels, he would go get them himself. But to understand the full scope of what Patton was planning, to grasp just how close we came to the Third World War starting in 1945 instead of staying cold, you need to understand the military situation on the ground in Germany in those chaotic weeks after VE Day. The American and Soviet armies, having crushed Nazi Germany between them like a vice, now stood face to face across a line that ran through the heart of Europe. In some places, that line was clearly defined, the Elbe River, where American and Soviet troops had met in late April in scenes of manufactured brotherhood, awkward toasts with vodka and whiskey, and posed photographs of Americans and Russians shaking hands. But in other areas, the situation was fluid and dangerous. Occupation zones had been agreed upon at Yalta and other high-level conferences, but on the ground, military realities didn't always match diplomatic maps. Patton's Third Army controlled vast swathes of what would eventually become East Germany and Czechoslovakia, territory that was supposed to be turned over to Soviet control, but hadn't been yet. And that gave Patton options. The general assembled a team of officers he trusted completely, men who'd been with him since North Africa or Sicily, veterans who understood that some operations couldn't appear in official reports. What he told them was both simple and terrifying. We're going to find our boys and bring them home, with or without Soviet permission. The first phase was intelligence gathering. Patton authorized covert reconnaissance missions into Soviet-occupied territory, small teams of soldiers in unmarked vehicles, often at night, tasked with locating facilities where Americans were believed to be held. These weren't official operations. If a team was caught by Soviet forces, there would be no rescue, no diplomatic intervention. The men understood they were volunteers for missions that officially didn't exist. Some of these reconnaissance teams were composed of American soldiers who spoke Russian or Polish, men whose families had immigrated from Eastern Europe and who could pass for locals if necessary. Others included former intelligence operatives who'd spent the war behind enemy lines and knew how to move unseen. What these teams discovered was worse than Patton had feared. American POWs were scattered across dozens of locations, from repurposed German camps to Soviet military facilities to improvised detention centers in schools and warehouses. The conditions varied. Some Americans were being treated reasonably well, given the chaos of the post-war situation, but others were in desperate shape, sick and malnourished, confused about why their own liberation had turned into continued captivity. The reports that came back to Patton's headquarters painted a picture of deliberate Soviet obstruction. In several cases, American POWs had been moved just hours or days before official Allied inspection teams arrived, shuffled from location to location to prevent their discovery. In others, Soviet officers had simply lied, denying that any Americans were present even when American reconnaissance had confirmed their presence. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from a handful of Americans who'd managed to escape Soviet custody and make their way to American lines. These men told stories of Soviet interrogators who seemed obsessed with what the Americans had seen during their captivity, what they knew about Soviet military capabilities, and whether they'd witnessed Soviet treatment of returning Soviet citizens. The implication was chilling. Stalin's forces were holding Americans not just as leverage for the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens, but also because they represented potential witnesses to Soviet war crimes and the brutality of the Soviet system. Patton took this information directly to General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. In a meeting that witnesses described as explosive, Eisenhower, who was trying to navigate impossible political waters, balancing military realities with diplomatic necessities and direct orders from Washington, urged caution. George, we can't just march into Soviet-occupied territory and start taking prisoners back by force, Eisenhower reportedly said. We're supposed to be allies. We're trying to establish the United Nations, build a peaceful post-war order. If we start a shooting war with the Russians over this, everything falls apart. Patton's response was characteristic, Ike. There are boys, American soldiers who've already been through hell in German camps. Now they're prisoners of the Russians, and nobody seems to give a damn because it's not politically convenient. With all due respect, sir, I don't give a shit about the post-war order if it means abandoning Americans behind enemy lines. The meeting ended without resolution, but Patton remained convinced that official channels would never recover the missing POWs, at least not in time. Some of them were already being moved deeper into Soviet territory toward the gulags of Siberia, where they'd vanish completely. If action was going to be taken, it had to be soon, and it had to be unofficial. What Patton planned next was technically insubordination, possibly even treason depending on how you interpreted his orders. But to the general who'd always believed that his first duty was to the soldiers under his command, the choice was clear. He began positioning elements of the Third Army for what he called repatriation enforcement operations, a bureaucratic euphemism for military raids into Soviet-held territory. Tank companies and mechanized infantry battalions received orders to be ready to move on short notice. Fuel and ammunition supplies were stockpiled. Routes were planned that would allow rapid penetration into areas where American POWs were known to be held, followed by, equally, rapid withdrawal back to American lines. Patton was preparing for war with the Soviet Union, a limited war with specific objectives, but war nonetheless. The soldiers being prepared for these operations were told they were part of a contingency plan, a response in case Soviet-American relations deteriorated. Most didn't know the full scope of what Patton intended, but the officers planning the operations understood exactly what they were doing, preparing to attack the forces of a nation that was technically an ally, to recover American prisoners by force. If these operations had been launched, if Patton had given the order, the consequences would have been incalculable. American and Soviet forces, veterans of the brutal fight against Nazi Germany, would have been killing each other in the ruins of that defeated nation. The fragile alliance that had defeated Hitler would have shattered completely. The Cold War, which in our timeline remained mostly cold, might have turned hot immediately with nuclear weapons. Development racing forward in both countries and the very real possibility of World War III. But Patton didn't care about these grand strategic implications. In his mind, the calculation was simple. Thousands of American soldiers were prisoners. The politicians and diplomats were doing nothing effective to free them, and he had the military capability to go get them. Everything else was secondary. His staff, loyal but increasingly concerned, tried to present alternatives. Sir, what if we create an incident? Stage something that gives us an excuse to enter Soviet territory. Officially? One colonel suggested. Patton rejected it. Too slow, too complicated, and it still relies on the politicians approving. By the time we get permission, if we ever do, those boys will be in Siberia. Another officer proposed a more subtle approach. What if we offer the Soviets something they want? A trade? Patton's response was profane and unprintable in official histories, but the gist was that he refused to negotiate with kidnappers. The planning continued, and the timeline for potential operations grew shorter. Patton set a deadline in his own mind. If diplomatic efforts hadn't produced substantial results by mid-June, he would launch the raids, regardless of orders from higher command. It was a decision that would likely end his career, possibly land him in front of a court-martial, and might even result in his imprisonment. But George Patton had never been a man who let personal consequences override what he saw as moral necessity. The situation reached a crisis point in early June when one of Patton's reconnaissance teams was captured by Soviet forces while attempting to verify the location of a camp allegedly holding over 200 Americans. The team, 3 soldiers in civilian clothes, carrying false identification papers, was caught at a Soviet checkpoint and detained. For 36 hours, Patton and his staff had no information about their fate. The general was beside himself, pacing his headquarters, chain-smoking cigars, contemplating whether this incident would be the trigger for the operations he'd planned. If the Soviets executed those 3 Americans, Patton later told his aide, he would have immediately launched the raids. Orders be damned. Consequences be damned. The entire future of American-Soviet relations hung by a thread, dependent on what Soviet officers did with 3 captured American soldiers in unmarked uniforms. Then, unexpectedly, the crisis broke in an unexpected direction. The 3 Americans were released at a formal checkpoint crossing, handed over to American military police with a stern Soviet protest about unauthorized personnel in Soviet occupation zones. No explanation was given for their release, but intelligence officers analyzing the situation concluded that the Soviets were sending a message. They knew what Patton was planning. They knew about the reconnaissance operations, and they were warning him to back off. But the incident had another effect. It reached Washington. The reports of the capture and release, combined with growing evidence that Patton was preparing unauthorized military operations against Soviet forces, triggered alarm bells at the highest levels of the American government. President Truman, who'd only been in office since Roosevelt's death in April and was still finding his footing in international affairs, was briefed on the situation. His response was to send explicit orders through the chain of command. General Patton was to stand down, avoid any provocative actions towards Soviet forces, and allow diplomatic channels to handle the POW situation. For Patton, These orders represented the moment of decision. He could obey, stand down his forces, and watch as American prisoners disappeared into the Soviet system while diplomats exchanged polite notes that accomplished nothing. Or he could disobey, launch the operations, and accept the consequences. Before we continue with what Patton decided and what actually happened to those American POWs, a story that will shock you, I want to ask you again, have you subscribed yet? Seriously, click that button, because the next part of this story involves classified operations that weren't fully declassified until the 1990s, details that most documentaries and history books skip over. And keep those comments coming. Where are you watching from? And do you think Patton should have launched those raids regardless of orders? Would you have disobeyed direct orders from the president to save American soldiers? There's no easy answer, and I want to hear what you think. Now, let's talk about what George Patton actually did when he received those orders to stand down, and how a general who'd never backed down from a fight in his life handled the most difficult decision of his career. Patton sat in his quarters the night he received Truman's stand-down order, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the desk beside him, staring at maps of Soviet-occupied territory marked with the locations of American prisoners. His aide, who brought him the decoded message from Washington, later described the general's face as looking like a man at a funeral for someone he loved. For perhaps the first time in his military career, George S. Patton was truly defeated, not by an enemy army, not by lack of supplies or reinforcements, but by his own government. But Patton being Patton, even in defeat he refused to surrender completely. If he couldn't launch military operations to recover the POWs, he would find every other possible avenue to bring them home. What followed was a campaign of pressure, intimidation, and creative interpretation of orders that would have gotten any other general relieved of command. Patton began making unannounced inspection visits to points along the American-Soviet boundary, always with heavy military escorts, always with tanks and armored vehicles, prominently displayed, always making sure Soviet observers could see the massive military force at his disposal. These weren't reconnaissance missions, they were shows of force, deliberate demonstrations that the American Third Army was ready, willing, and capable of crossing that boundary whenever ordered. Soviet commanders complained through official channels about these provocative displays. Patton's response, delivered through diplomatic liaisons with barely concealed contempt, was that he was simply inspecting his own forces in his own occupation zone, and the Soviets could go to hell if they didn't like it. Simultaneously, Patton authorized what he called aggressive liaison operations. American officers were sent to every checkpoint, every boundary crossing, every point of contact with Soviet forces, with orders to demand information about American POWs, to present lists of names, to refuse to be brushed off with vague promises and bureaucratic deflection. These officers were instructed to be polite but persistent to the point of obnoxiousness, to file formal protests about every denial of information, to create a paper trail so extensive that the Soviet obstruction couldn't be hidden or denied. The goal was to make the POW issue so visible, so documented, so impossible to ignore that political pressure would build on both the American and Soviet governments to resolve it. Patton also began cultivating relationships with journalists, carefully leaking information about the missing POWs to reporters who could be trusted to ask difficult questions. This was dangerous territory. The American government wanted to avoid public confrontation with the Soviets over the issue, preferring quiet diplomacy. But stories began appearing in American newspapers about servicemen who hadn't come home, about families who'd been told their sons were liberated, but had then received no further word about. The troubling silence from the government about exactly how many Americans were still unaccounted for in Soviet-occupied areas. The public pressure these stories generated gave the State Department less room to quietly accept Soviet stonewalling. But perhaps Patton's most effective tactic was the one that most directly violated the spirit, if not the letter of his orders. He refused to withdraw American forces from areas that had been designated for Soviet occupation. The agreements made at Yalta and Potsdam called for American forces to pull back from certain areas of Germany and Czechoslovakia, turning them over to Soviet control. These withdrawals were supposed to happen on specific timelines. Patton simply didn't comply. When pressed by Eisenhower about the delays, Patton produced an endless stream of logistical justifications. His forces needed more time to process displaced persons. There were concerns about security in the areas, and supply lines needed to be reorganized. Every excuse was technically plausible, and Eisenhower, who understood exactly what Patton was doing even if he couldn't officially acknowledge it, gave him more latitude than he should have. The real reason for the delays was leverage. As long as American forces occupied territory the Soviets wanted, Patton had bargaining power. Soviet commanders who wanted the Americans to withdraw were told, informally and unofficially, that cooperation on the POW issue would expedite the process. It was diplomatic hostage-taking in reverse, and while it infuriated Soviet leadership and caused headaches for American diplomats, it worked. Starting in late June 1945, the pace of American POW repatriations from Soviet custody began to increase. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the numbers started moving in the right direction. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A Soviet officer named Colonel Alexei Volkov, who'd been working as a liaison with American forces, approached one of Patton's intelligence officers with a proposal. Volkov was a complicated figure, a Red Army veteran, who'd fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, a committed communist, but also a man who seemed genuinely disturbed by some of what he'd witnessed as Soviet forces liberated their own citizens. He'd seen the NKVD arrests, the loading of Soviet POWs onto trains bound for the Gulag, the summary executions of people accused of collaboration. And he'd also seen American POWs caught in this machinery, held not for any legitimate military reason but as pawns in Stalin's paranoid power games. Volkov couldn't directly oppose his government's policies, but he could provide information. He told the American intelligence officer about a major transit facility near D in Poland, a former German military barracks that was being used to process prisoners of various nationalities before their repatriation or relocation. According to Volkov, over 400 American POWs were at this facility, scheduled to be moved deeper into Soviet territory within the next 2 weeks. Once they were moved, Volkov said, they'd effectively disappear. The Soviet system would swallow them, and extracting them would become nearly impossible. This was the kind of intelligence Patton had been desperate for, specific, timely, actionable. But it also presented an impossible dilemma. The facility was deep in Soviet-controlled Poland, far beyond any territory American forces could plausibly access without it being an obvious military incursion. The window to act was narrow, 2 weeks at most, and Patton was under explicit orders not to conduct military operations against Soviet positions. For 3 days, Patton wrestled with the decision. He called in his most trusted officers, war-game scenarios, calculated odds and consequences. The military operation itself would be straightforward. A fast mechanized column could reach D, secure the facility, extract the Americans, and withdraw before Soviet forces could effectively respond. It would be audacious. Aggressive, exactly the kind of operation Patton had executed brilliantly throughout the war. But the political and strategic consequences would be catastrophic. It would be an act of war. Against the Soviet Union, there was no way to frame it otherwise. Patton would be court-martialed, certainly. The fragile American-Soviet alliance would shatter. The entire post-war settlement in Europe would collapse, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't escalate into full-scale conflict. Against all of that, Patton weighed 400 American soldiers who'd survived German captivity only to become Soviet prisoners. Men who would vanish into Stalin's Gulag system if someone didn't act. In his memoirs, never published but preserved in his personal papers, Patton wrote about this decision. "I have ordered men to their deaths more times than I can count. I have made decisions that cost thousands of lives in pursuit of military objectives. But I have never faced a choice quite like this. Certainty that I could save 400 Americans, and equal certainty that doing so would destroy my career and possibly trigger a war that could kill millions. How does a man weigh 400 lives he can see and name against millions of hypothetical casualties? I still don't know the answer." In the end, Patton made a characteristically Patton-esque decision. He would split the difference. He wouldn't launch a military raid on the facility in Lodz, but he wouldn't do anything either. He would go himself, personally, with a small staff and minimal military escort, directly to the facility, and demand the release of the American POWs. It was insane. It violated protocol, chain of command, diplomatic procedure, and basic common sense. A Soviet officer could have shot him on sight and been within his technical rights. But Patton was gambling on several factors. His personal fame and reputation, which extended even into the Red Army, the Soviets' desire to avoid an international incident, and the fundamental absurdity of the situation if the Soviets were going to repatriate these Americans eventually. Anyway, as they claimed, what reason could they give for refusing when an American general showed up personally to collect them? On July 3, 1945, Patton left his headquarters before dawn in a small convoy of vehicles. 2 jeeps and a truck, with a total of 15 men, including himself. He'd informed Eisenhower of his intentions in a message that was deliberately vague about timing and specifics, phrased in a way that gave Ike plausible deniability. The message essentially said that Patton was going to attempt direct negotiation with Soviet authorities regarding POW repatriation, and that if Eisenhower wanted to order him not to, he should send that order immediately. Eisenhower, whether through tacit approval or simply not wanting to know the details, didn't send a stop order. The drive to D took nearly 12 hours, through devastated countryside still recovering from the war, past columns of displaced persons heading in every direction, through Soviet checkpoints where Patton's sheer audacity and the presence of his famous ivory-handled pistols seemed to paralyze the guards into letting him pass. By the time the convoy reached the facility, word had spread through Soviet channels that the famous American general was coming. When Patton's jeep pulled up to the gates of the former barracks, he was met by a Soviet colonel who looked simultaneously terrified and confused. The colonel spoke English, fortunately, though his accent was heavy. "General Patton, this is highly irregular. You have no authorization to be here. This facility is under Soviet authority." Patton climbed out of the jeep slowly, letting the colonel see his rank insignia, his medals, his pistols, the sheer presence that had intimidated German generals, and now focused entirely on one Soviet colonel who'd never expected to have to deal with anything like this. "Colonel," Patton said with exaggerated courtesy, "I have come to collect my men. American soldiers who were liberated from German captivity and who should have been repatriated weeks ago. I have a list of their names. I have transport to take them home, and I'm not leaving without them. What happened next? The tense standoff. The desperate calls the Soviet colonel made to his superiors, and whether Patton actually got those. 400 Americans out of that facility. That's where this story takes a turn that even I found hard to believe when I first researched it. But before we get to that, I need to know, are you still with me? Drop a quick comment. Hit that like button so I know you want to hear the rest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? This is the kind of history that matters. The real stories behind the sanitized versions they teach in school. The Soviet colonel, whose name was later recorded as Dmitry Kozlov, stared at Patton with an expression that mixed disbelief, fear, and grudging respect. He was in an impossible position. Standing before him was one of the most famous military commanders in the world, a man whose Third Army had torn through German defenses like a knife through paper, demanding something that Kozlov had no authority to grant. On the other hand, his orders from Moscow were explicit. American POWs at the facility were not to be released without proper authorization through channels, and those channels were deliberately designed to move at a glacial pace. Kozlov asked Patton to wait while he made phone calls. The general's response was to walk past him, through the gates, and into the facility itself. "Make your calls, Colonel," Patton said over his shoulder. "I'll be inside talking to my men." It was a power move that left the Soviet officer with no good options. He could try to physically stop Patton, which would mean Soviet guards putting hands on an American general, an international incident of the first magnitude. Or he could let Patton proceed and deal with the consequences from his own chain of command. He chose the latter, hurrying after Patton while barking orders in Russian to his subordinates. What Patton found inside the facility shocked him despite all the intelligence reports he'd read. The American POWs were being held in conditions that, while not as horrific as the German camps they'd been liberated from, were nevertheless degrading and unnecessary. They were confined to barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by Soviet soldiers, given minimal food and provided no information about when or if they'd be released. Many were sick, dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated wounds from their time in German captivity. All were confused and demoralized, unable to understand why their liberation had turned into continued imprisonment. When Patton walked into the first barracks, the response was electric. The Americans, many of whom recognized him immediately from newsreels and photographs, couldn't believe what they were seeing. General George S. Patton, in person, in a Soviet facility deep in Poland, asking for their names and promising to take them home. Men wept openly. Others stood at attention. Despite their ragged condition, trying to maintain military bearing in front of a general they'd only dreamed about meeting. Patton moved through the barracks methodically, speaking to soldiers, taking notes, observing conditions. His face grew darker with each passing minute. These weren't enemy prisoners being held for legitimate security reasons. These were American soldiers being kept like livestock, pawns in a political game they didn't understand. After touring the facility for nearly an hour, with Colonel Kozlov trailing behind him in increasing distress, Patton returned to the commandant's office. He found Kozlov on the phone, speaking rapidly in Russian to someone who was clearly very senior based on the colonel's deferential tone. When Kozlov hung up, he turned to Patton with an expression of misery. "General Patton, I have spoken with my superiors. They say that proper procedures must be followed. There are protocols, documentation requirements, coordination with your State Department through official channels. These men cannot simply be released to you without authorization. Patton pulled up a chair, sat down uninvited, and lit a cigar. Colonel, let me explain something to you. I'm not leaving this facility without those Americans. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You can call Stalin himself if you want, but the result will be the same. Those men are coming with me. Kozlov protested, increasingly frantic. You have no authority. This is Soviet-controlled territory. I cannot simply release prisoners without orders. Patton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a quiet intensity that was somehow more threatening than shouting. Let me tell you what's going to happen if you don't release those men. First, I'm going to go outside and tell them to get in my trucks. If your guards try to stop them, we're going to have a situation. Second, I'm going to drive out of here with every American in this facility. If your guards try to stop me at the gate, we're going to have a bigger situation. Third, news of this. An American general physically recovering POWs from Soviet custody over Soviet objections is going to reach every newspaper in America and Europe. The political fallout will make the Yalta Conference look like a tea party. He paused, letting that sink in. Or you can make one more phone call, explain to whoever's on the other end that the American general is here and won't leave without his men, and ask for permission to release them to my custody with proper documentation. You still follow your procedures. We both get what we want, and nobody has to explain to Stalin why this turned into an international incident. It was a bluff mostly. Patton had no real authority to do what he was threatening. If Soviet guards had actually tried to stop him, his options would have been to back down or start a firefight that could trigger World War III. But Patton understood something crucial about bureaucracies, even Soviet ones. The people on the ground are terrified of making decisions that could get them in trouble with their superiors. If Kozlov could get authorization, even reluctant authorization, he'd be covered. If he had to make the decision himself to either shoot at American soldiers or let them go, he'd be vulnerable to accusations of weakness or unauthorized action. Kozlov made another phone call, this one longer and more animated. Patton couldn't understand the Russian, but he could read the body language. Desperation, pleading, relief. When Kozlov hung up, he looked like a man who just avoided execution. I have conditional authorization, he said carefully. You may take custody of the American personnel at this facility, provided we document each individual. You sign receipts acknowledging their transfer, and this is processed through proper channels retroactively. Patton stood up and extended his hand. That's acceptable, Colonel. Let's get started. What followed was bureaucratic marathon that lasted through the night. Every one of the 423 American POWs at the facility, more than the intelligence had indicated, had to be individually documented. Names, ranks, serial numbers, condition, location where originally captured, and a dozen other details were recorded in triplicate on Soviet forms. Patton insisted on American medics examining each man and providing their own documentation of condition and treatment. The process was tedious, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. This paperwork would be the proof that the men had been in Soviet custody, the evidence for future diplomatic protests and historical record. Throughout the night, Patton remained at the facility, refusing to leave until every man was processed and loaded onto trucks. He spoke with dozens of the soldiers, hearing their stories of liberation turned to continued captivity, of confusion and fear, of the grinding uncertainty of not knowing if they'd ever get home. One sergeant from Ohio told Patton that Soviet officers had interrogated him repeatedly about what he'd seen during his liberation, about other prisoners, about whether he'd witnessed Soviet treatment of their own returning citizens. They seemed Really concerned about what we'd tell people when we got home, sir, the sergeant said. Like, they were worried we'd seen too much. As dawn broke on July 4th, Independence Day, which Patton later said was divine, Providence, the convoy of American trucks, now carrying over 400 liberated POWs, prepared to leave the facility. Colonel Kozlov, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past, 24 hours, presented Patton with a stack of documents and receipts. General Patton, he said formally, I am transferring these prisoners to your custody. I must protest, for the record, the irregular nature of this operation. Patton signed the documents with a flourish and then did something unexpected. He saluted the Soviet colonel. Colonel Kozlov, you're a good soldier stuck in a bad situation. I respect that. You did the right thing here, and I won't forget it. The drive back to American lines took most of the day. The convoy had to stop frequently for soldiers who were too sick or weak to endure the long journey without breaks. American medics distributed rations, water, and medical supplies. As word spread along the route that Patton himself was bringing back American POWs from Soviet custody, civilians emerged from villages to watch the convoy pass, some cheering, others just staring at this tangible symbol of the strange new world emerging from the war's end. When the convoy finally crossed into American-controlled territory, the celebration was spontaneous and overwhelming. Soldiers at the boundary checkpoint initially couldn't believe what they were seeing, then erupted into cheers when they realized what had happened. Word spread rapidly through the command structure. Patton had actually done it, had gone into Soviet-held territory and brought back over 400 Americans. By the time the convoy reached the nearest major American facility, where the POWs could receive proper medical care and processing, a crowd had gathered. Officers, enlisted men, medics, and support personnel all wanted to see the men who'd been recovered, to shake Patton's hand, to be part of this moment. But the general slipped away before the celebration could really begin, returning to his headquarters with just his small personal staff. He knew what was coming. Supreme. Headquarters would have questions. Washington would have questions. The State Department would be furious about the diplomatic complications. The Soviets would file protests. This victory would have consequences. The telegram from Eisenhower arrived within hours. Return to headquarters immediately. Explanation required for unauthorized operation in Soviet territory. Consider this a direct order. Patton read it, smiled grimly, and began writing his response. But before we get to what happened to Patton after this operation, before we talk about the consequences he faced and the larger story of American POWs who weren't as fortunate as those 423 men, I want to hear from you again. What do you think? Did Patton do the right thing? Should he have followed orders and stayed away, letting diplomats handle it? Or was he right to risk everything to bring those soldiers home? Comment below with your thoughts. And if this story has kept you engaged, if you want to hear more true stories from World War II that challenge the standard narratives, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're just getting to the most controversial part of this story. What happened to the American POWs who weren't at that facility in D, and the dark secret that both the American and Soviet governments kept hidden for decades. Patton's unauthorized rescue operation at D sent shockwaves through both the American and Soviet command structures, but the reactions were not what anyone expected. Eisenhower, when he met with Patton 3 days later, was caught between fury at the insubordination and reluctant admiration for the results. The meeting, which took place in private with no official record, was described years later by Eisenhower's aide as the only time I ever saw Ike genuinely uncertain whether to court-martial someone or pin a medal on them. According to witnesses who pieced together what was said, Eisenhower opened with George, "What the hell were you thinking?" And Patton responded with, "I was thinking about 400 American soldiers who were about to disappear into the Soviet Union forever. And I decided that was unacceptable." The argument that followed ranged across strategy, politics, military authority, and moral responsibility. But ultimately, Eisenhower was trapped by the same factor that had protected Patton throughout his career: results. The general had brought home over 400 Americans without firing a shot, without causing an international incident that escalated beyond diplomatic protests, and most importantly, without getting anyone killed. The Soviet response, while officially outraged, was surprisingly muted. Yes, they filed protests through diplomatic channels about American forces operating without authorization in Soviet-controlled territory. But they didn't push it as hard as they could have, and analysts at the time believed they understood why. The Soviets didn't want to draw too much attention to the fact that they'd been holding American POWs in the first place, that their claims of full repatriation had been exposed as lies. The 423 Americans recovered from D were processed, provided medical care, debriefed by intelligence officers, and within weeks were on ships heading home to the United States. There, stories, when they reached American newspapers, carefully edited to avoid inflaming U.S.-Soviet tensions, caused public outrage and renewed pressure on the government to account for all missing American servicemen. How many more were still out there? How many had been in Soviet custody and hadn't been returned? These were questions that the War Department struggled to answer because the truth was deeply uncomfortable. The official numbers were murky, deliberately so. The War Department acknowledged that some American POWs liberated by Soviet forces had experienced delays in repatriation, but insisted that these were administrative issues, not deliberate detention. The Soviets, for their part, maintained that all American prisoners had been processed and returned through proper channels. Both statements were lies of omission. The reality, which wouldn't be fully documented until declassified documents emerged decades later, was those thousands of American servicemen had passed through Soviet custody in the war's final months. And while most were eventually repatriated, the numbers didn't quite add up. Conservative estimates suggested that anywhere from 20,000 to 25,000 Americans had been in German POW camps overrun by Soviet forces. Official repatriation numbers accounted for roughly 22 to 23,000. That left a gap, potentially thousands of men whose fate remained uncertain. Some of that gap could be explained by deaths during captivity that hadn't been properly documented, by men who'd escaped and made their way home through other routes, by administrative errors in the chaos of processing millions of displaced persons. But there remained a core group. Estimates ranged from several hundred to as many as 2,000 Americans who seemed to have simply vanished after Soviet forces liberated them. Where did they go? This question haunted American intelligence agencies and would remain partially unanswered for generations. The darkest scenario, and the one that evidence increasingly supported, was that some Americans were deliberately retained by the Soviet Union. Why would Stalin do this? The reasons were complex and chilling. First, there was the intelligence value. Some of the American POWs had technical knowledge, pilots who understood American aviation technology, engineers who'd worked on classified projects, officers with strategic knowledge. The NVD, Soviet intelligence, would have found such men valuable for interrogation about American military capabilities. Second, there was the leverage factor we discussed earlier. Keeping Americans gave Stalin bargaining power over the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens who'd been in German hands. Third, and perhaps most disturbing, was ideological exploitation. The Soviets identified Americans who expressed left-wing political views or who seemed disillusioned with capitalism and attempted to recruit them as propaganda assets or even as agents who could return to America. Most refused, but some, worn down by captivity, confused, or genuinely converted, cooperated. What happened to Americans who were deliberately retained by the Soviets? The evidence is fragmentary, often based on decades-old testimony from Soviet defectors and released prisoners, but a disturbing picture emerges. Some were held in interrogation facilities where NKVD specialists systematically extracted information about American military capabilities, technology, and strategic thinking. These interrogations could last months, combining psychological manipulation, deprivation, and occasionally physical coercion. Once the Soviets had extracted everything useful, these Americans faced a terrible choice: cooperate with Soviet intelligence going forward or be sent to the Gulag system. Those who refused cooperation and were sent to the gulags entered a hell that in some ways was worse than the German POW camps they'd survived. The Soviet labor camp system was designed to extract maximum work from prisoners while providing minimum sustenance, a calculation that resulted in death rates of 20–30% or higher in the harshest camps. Americans in the Gulag faced additional challenges. They didn't speak Russian, didn't understand the complex, informal hierarchies among prisoners, and were often targeted by both guards and other inmates as representatives of the capitalist enemy. Soviet records, when they were finally opened in the 1990s after the Soviet Union's collapse, contained tantalizing hints about foreign prisoners in the Gulag system. References to Americans appeared in documents from camps in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic regions. Most didn't include names, just nationalities and prisoner numbers. Researchers, attempting to track individual Americans, found a bureaucratic maze of lost records, destroyed files, and deliberate obfuscation. The few Americans who did eventually return from Soviet captivity, some released in the 1950s, during brief thaws in Cold War tensions, others not until the 1960s or even later, told stories that were almost too horrific to believe. They described years in labor camps, of watching fellow Americans die from exhaustion, cold, and starvation. They spoke of friends who'd given up hope and simply stopped trying to survive. They recounted the desperate effort to maintain their identities as Americans, to remember their names and service numbers and hometowns, when the Gulag system was designed to strip away individual identity and reduce prisoners to anonymous labor units. One of the most documented cases was Technical Sergeant John H. Noble, an American who ended up in Soviet custody through a complicated series of events involving his family's business in Dresden. Noble spent 9 years in Soviet labor camps and prisons from 1945 to 1955, and his testimony after his release provided one of the few detailed accounts of what Americans experienced in the Gulag. He described encountering other Americans in the camps, men who'd been POWs liberated from German camps and then simply swallowed by the Soviet system. Most of their names are lost to history. Noble's account was initially dismissed by some as Cold War propaganda, but as more evidence emerged and Soviet records became partially accessible, historians concluded that his testimony was essentially accurate. If Noble's experience was representative, and there's reason to believe it was, then dozens or possibly hundreds of American servicemen spent years in Soviet labor camps, forgotten by their government, abandoned by the diplomatic process that was supposed to protect them. Back in 1945, as the immediate post-war period unfolded, Patton continued to agitate for more aggressive action on the POW issue. His success at D had emboldened him, but it had also made him more aware of how many men were still missing, still unaccounted for. He pushed for More rescue operations, for American forces to refuse to withdraw from Soviet-designated territory until all Americans were accounted for diplomatic pressure to escalate into ultimatums. But the political reality was working against him. The Truman administration was focused on establishing the United Nations, on creating a framework for post-war cooperation, on avoiding confrontation with the Soviet Union even as evidence mounted that Stalin was not a partner but an adversary. Patton's increasingly vocal criticism of Soviet behavior, his public statements that America should prepare for eventual conflict with communism, made him a political liability. In October 1945, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to a largely ceremonial position overseeing the compilation of war histories. It was a demotion disguised as an honorable reassignment, a way of moving him aside without the controversy of an outright firing. Patton was devastated, though he tried to maintain a public face of acceptance. In private letters and diary entries, he expressed bitter anger at what he saw as political cowardice, at a government more concerned with Soviet sensibilities than with American soldiers. On December 9, 1945, Patton was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His neck was broken, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21st, of complications from his injuries. The official investigation concluded it was a simple traffic accident, one of thousands that occurred in occupied Germany in the chaotic post-war period. But conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately and have persisted for decades. Some claimed Soviet agents had orchestrated the accident to eliminate a general who'd become too vocal about Soviet crimes and too popular to simply silence through official channels. Others suggested American intelligence was involved, fearing that Patton's increasingly reckless statements about the Soviet Union would damage diplomatic efforts. There is no credible evidence for either theory. The accident appears to have been genuinely accidental, a tragic end to a complicated life. But the timing, coming just months after his unauthorized rescue operation and his relief from command, fed speculation that continues to this day. What is certain is that with Patton's death, the American military lost its most vocal advocate for aggressive action on the POW issue. Other officers cared about the missing men, but none had Patton's combination of rank, fame, and willingness to defy authority to do something about it. The issue gradually faded from public consciousness as the immediate post-war period gave way to the emerging Cold War, as Americans focused on demobilization and returning to peacetime life, as the missing POWs became a bureaucratic problem rather than a moral crisis. The families of men who never came home faced an agonizing uncertainty that, in some cases, lasted decades. Some received official notifications that their sons or husbands were missing in action, a status that offered neither the closure of death nor the hope of return. Others were told their loved ones had died in captivity, but without details, without remains to bury, without any real confirmation. A very few, eventually learned that their family members had been in Soviet custody, had been seen in labor camps, and had survived into the 1950s or beyond. But for most, there was only silence and unanswered questions. The full truth about American POWs in Soviet hands would remain classified or obscured until the 1990s, when the collapse of the Soviet Union opened archives and allowed researchers to begin piecing together what had happened. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions. Yes, the Soviets had deliberately retained some Americans. Yes, some had been sent to the Gulag. Yes, both the Soviet and American governments had known more than they acknowledged. And yes, political considerations had been prioritized over the lives of individual soldiers. It's an ugly chapter of History, one that raises uncomfortable questions about governmental priorities, about the moral compromises nations make in pursuit of diplomatic goals, and about what we owe to soldiers who serve in our name. George Patton, for all his flaws, and he had many, from his theatrical self-promotion to his controversial political views to his sometimes reckless disregard for orders, understood something fundamental. Individual soldiers are not abstractions. Not statistics. Not acceptable losses in diplomatic negotiations. They are people with names and families and lives, and recovering them, accounting for them, honoring the commitment that they, nation made when it sent them to war, takes priority over political convenience. Before we wrap up this story, I want to ask you one final time, if you've made it this far, if this story has moved you or made you think differently about this period of history, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. We're committed to telling the stories that matter, the ones that complicate the simple narratives, the ones that reveal the human cost of political decisions. And please, comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you have a family connection to World War II, if anyone in your family served, if you've heard stories about the post-war period that echo what we've discussed today. Share this video with someone who cares about history, about veterans, about the complicated truth behind the headlines. These stories matter because the people in them mattered. The 423 Americans Patton rescued from the unknown number who weren't so lucky, the families who waited for sons who never came home, and yes, even the controversial general who was willing to risk everything to bring his boys back. History isn't just about the big decisions made in conference rooms and the battles that shifted borders. It's also about individual choices, moral courage, and the refusal to accept that some people are expendable. Thank you for reading. Thank you for caring about these stories. And remember, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it. So let's make sure we know the whole story, not just the sanitized version.